Hey guys, welcome back to another unnecessarily detailed dive into the weirdest corners of human history. You could be watching cat videos or learning how to fold a fitted sheet, but no, you chose to learn about ancient Roman dating rituals, and I deeply respect that. Or at least, I acknowledge it. Either way, thanks for being here. This episode is all about Roman romance, or more accurately, the complete and utter absence of it. Because if you're imagining candlelit dinners, handwritten poetry, or even basic emotional compatibility, oh no, baby. You're in the wrong millennium. Before we start, why don't you drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, whether you're winding down for bed, driving through the night, or stuck somewhere doing something you regret. I love knowing how far down the procrastination rabbit hole we've all slid together. And feel free to change the play speed if I'm talking too fast or too slow. So, Roman dating. Let's set the mood. Imagine you're living in ancient Rome. The streets smell like wet ashtrays, the air tastes vaguely metallic, and everything you touch has probably been washed in fermented urine. Because it was. That was their detergent. They didn't even try to hide it. Now, you're thinking of falling in love. Or rather, your parents are, because love wasn't really a factor. Marriage in Rome, especially if you were wealthy or even semi-wealthy, was less about affection and more about property consolidation with light fondling on the side. If your father could marry you off to a man with land, political connections, and a suspicious number of pet peacocks, he absolutely would, whether you liked it or not. The idea of choosing your own partner was exotic, suspicious, almost Greek, which, ironically, was also considered sexy, just not practical. For Roman men, things were a bit more flexible. They could technically flirt, and by flirt I mean complimenting your neck folds. Yes, that was a thing. Roman poets, who were basically the ancient version of thirst posting, would go on and on about the neck. The folds, the shadows, the way it wrinkled when you tilted your head. Apparently, if your neck looked like a well-pleated bedsheet, you were considered a catch. And speaking Greek, huge bonus. Not because it was romantic, it just meant you were educated, rich, or both. Also possibly insufferable at parties. But let's say you were a Roman woman, upper class, unmarried, and perhaps tragically cursed with opinions. Your life was a tightly scheduled game of keep away. You were either chaperoned or indoors, always watched, always managed. You didn't stroll down to the forum for a latte and a scroll. You stayed inside, embroidered things you hated, and waited to be traded like an expensive, moody goat. Now, if you weren't upper class, say, a servant, a slave, or just poor enough that soap was a concept you'd only heard of in riddles, your situation was, shockingly, worse. You were available, not in the dating app sense, in the terrifying society has decided your body is public property sense. The boundaries between love, ownership, and exploitation were, let's just say, blurry enough to make a modern HR department cry. There are love spells etched into Roman walls that basically say, I want her to burn with desire, forget her family, and crawl to me naked. Which, sure, sounds passionate. Until you remember that these were often carved by men who'd never spoken to the woman in question, and probably thought hygiene was optional. Speaking of hygiene, let's dive into that swamp. Yes, the Romans had baths. Grand, elaborate public bathhouses with marble columns and complicated plumbing. They were a marvel. They also didn't use soap. Instead, they'd rub olive oil all over themselves, let it mix with the day's filth, sweat, dust, maybe a hint of goat, and then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. It was like using salad dressing as a cleaning product and then squeegeeing it off your body with a butter knife. And deodorant? That's adorable. They had perfume. Lots of perfume. Most of it floral. All of it designed to cover up the fact that you hadn't washed your underarms since the last lunar eclipse. There's even a recipe involving rose petals and, wait for it, animal fat. Because nothing says irresistible like the faint aroma of dead sheep. Women's beauty products weren't any better. Want a pale, luminous complexion? Easy. Just apply a nice layer of white lead to your face every morning. Yes, lead. The thing that ruins pipes and causes organ failure. The Romans dabbed it on like concealer, with pride. Hair? Oiled into crunchy ringlets using bear grease or pig lard depending on your budget and how recently the bear lost that fight. And if your hair turned green from copper content in your comb. That was just a fun little personality quirk. Clothing wasn't exactly helpful either. Togas were mostly for men and mostly awful. Women wore stolas, long heavy dresses that dragged in the dust, the dirt, and probably a few street snacks you didn't notice stepping in. Underwear? If you're picturing anything cotton or breathable, stop. It was linen, if you were lucky, and held together by hope. And let's not forget the togas, lovingly laundered using, you guessed it, urine. Human urine. Collected from pots placed in public alleys. Imagine trying to flirt while knowing your outfit smells faintly of alley pee and despair. So, yes, courtship in Rome wasn't about chemistry. It was about wealth, family alliances, and trying not to vomit from the smell of your own date. But even if you weren't married off at 14 to a guy who thought emotional intimacy meant not yelling during dinner, you still weren't exactly free. The flirtation game, if it existed, was full of cryptic signals and dangerous implications. A glance could be an invitation, or an insult, or both, depending on the hour, the social class, and whether Mercury was in retrograde. But there was one thing that brought people together across class and gender. Food. Lavish, ostentatious, completely unsafe food. Because if there was one way to impress a Roman date, it was by feeding them something so expensive and weird that it screamed, "I have money, and I'm not afraid to waste it on peacock tongues and stuffed dormice." Of course, most of that food would probably kill you. But we'll get to that. First, maybe take a moment to appreciate how clean your clothes are. How no one has tried to marry you off to a 42-year-old man who smells like fermented cabbage and thinks Greek poetry is foreplay. We're only just getting started. Things are about to get slippery, literally. The Romans did terrible, fascinating things with fish sauce. So, refill your tea, adjust your blanket, or keep both hands on the wheel, because next we're sitting down at the Roman dinner table. And I hope you brought an iron stomach. So, you've made it through the courtship phase in ancient Rome. Congratulations. You've smiled politely at your date's unibrow, complimented their property holdings, and survived a conversation where someone probably compared your ankles to a well-fed goat's. Now comes the reward. Dinner. And by reward, I mean an elaborate, slow-motion gastrointestinal dare that starts with roasted rodents and ends in an existential crisis by candlelight. Because a Roman dinner party, what they called a cena, wasn't just a chance to eat. No, this was performance art, social theatre, a prestige flex. Imagine if your first date was hosted on a stage, catered by a haunted butcher, and judged by every guest in the room, and also by your ancestors, who were probably honoured with a ceremonial wine spill in the corner. These meals started around 4 or 5 p.m. and lasted until, whenever the last person keeled over or politely excused themselves to vomit behind a pillar. The host's job was to impress, and the guest's job was to pretend they weren't actively sweating through their tunic at the sight of deep-fried sow's udder, which, yes, was a thing. Look, if you think pork belly sounds indulgent, imagine biting into the mammary gland of a pig, lovingly boiled and served with honey. That was just appetizer territory. The main courses? Oh, honey, we're just getting warmed up. See, elite Romans were obsessed with exotic animals, not because they tasted good, but because they were expensive, hard to find, and made for fantastic bragging rights when casually stabbed on a serving tray. Think peacock tongues, flamingo stew, jellyfish soaked in spoiled vinegar wine. Nothing says come hither like something that smells like the inside of a fishmonger's sock drawer. And then there were the dormice. Cute little mice, fattened up on acorns, then stuffed with pine nuts and herbs. Basically the Roman version of a charcuterie board. If the board was alive 2 hours ago and had a name, they loved excess. They needed you to know they could afford waste, which is why dishes came out in waves. Some of them were hot, some cold, some looked like meat but were fish, some looked like fish but were probably meat. The only common thread was that everything was aggressively, suspiciously shiny, thanks to the liberal use of garum. Yes, garum. Let's talk about that. Garum was Rome's secret sauce, a fermented fish slurry made by taking the guts of mackerel or anchovies, leaving them out in the sun for a few weeks to gently decompose, and then straining the whole thing into jars. The smell was industrial, somewhere between low tide and what if ammonia had a hobby farm. But Romans didn't just use garum sparingly like a condiment, they used it on everything, on meat, on desserts, on your cousin's birthday cake. You could sneeze and land in a garum fountain. Why? Because salt preserved things. And in a world without refrigeration, salt was your only defense against whatever unholy science was growing on your pork. And yet, ironically, garum often masked spoilage, which meant it didn't save you from bad food. It just made the journey slightly more seasoned. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, at least the wine would help, right? Oh no, Buttercup. Oh no. The wine was worse. Roman wine wasn't just fermented grape juice. It was basically chemical warfare in a cup. First of all, they watered it down, not because they were sober curious, but because the wine itself tasted like feet and old barrels. To fix that, they added sapa, a thick syrup made by boiling down grape must in lead pots. Yes, lead. Which means every glass of wine came with a microdose of neurotoxin and a subtle note of, oh no, my kidneys, and they drank it constantly. It was safer than water, because Roman plumbing also had a lead problem. So if the meat didn't get you, and the fish sauce didn't get you, the wine was just waiting patiently in the corner with a polite smile and a heavy metal handshake. Now, here's the fun part. None of this food had labels. There were no allergy warnings, no may contain traces of rat. If you were lucky, the host described the dish, but that description might include phrases like, a noble fish from the western provinces, which could just mean this trout was kind of shaped like Caesar, and portion control. Ha, that's adorable. Roman meals were a marathon of gluttony. There was no such thing as I'm full. The entire point was to keep eating, keep drinking, and hope the gods were in a forgiving mood tonight. Imagine reclining on a cushion, surrounded by sweaty men in togas, while a server brings you a boiled goat lung garnished with parsley. You make eye contact with your date, who's gnawing on something that may or may not be swan meat. And then someone recites a poem, loudly, in Greek. That's how you flirted. That's how you seduced. But of course the food wasn't always fresh. Rome had a population in the hundreds of thousands and no Costco. The supply chain was chaos. Meat sat in markets for hours. Fish came in from the coast, sometimes days old, wrapped in straw and optimism. You wanted delicacies? You got parasites. Even the rich weren't immune. In fact, they were probably at higher risk, because their meals were riskier. If you're slapping together raw oysters, liquefied duck brain, and a wine sauce that tastes like a battery, you're playing microbial roulette. Now, let's be fair. The Romans weren't trying to kill themselves on purpose. They just didn't know better. Germ theory was 800 years away, and they thought illnesses came from imbalanced body fluids. evil winds or offending a minor kitchen deity by not clapping during a dinner poem. So, when someone doubled over in pain halfway through the fourth course, they didn't think, bad clams. They thought, the gods are punishing me for skipping the olive offering this morning. And if you were a guest, you nodded solemnly and kept eating, because refusing food was rude and vomiting in public was, honestly, expected. That brings us to the next part of the night, where our story continues, of course. But for now, let's just say this. If your Roman date ended in passion, you beat the odds. Most of them ended with a quietly desperate glance toward the latrine and a promise to the gods that if you survived the night, you'd never eat boiled eel in honey sauce again. Which, to be fair, is a promise you should make even today. So let's talk digestion. And by digestion, I mean the long, slow betrayal of your own body after a Roman dinner party. You may think your worst food experience was that gas station sushi you bought at 2 a.m. during a road trip. Oh no, sweetheart. Romans would have eaten that for breakfast and asked for seconds. But before we dive in, let's get one thing straight. Because someone, somewhere, probably told you this at a college party once. The vomitorium. Yeah, not a room for vomiting. Sorry, I know it sounds like a tiled dungeon for fashionable purging, but it was just an exit hallway in a stadium. Like the Roman version of that panic corridor you bolt through after a concert, when you realise you parked 4 blocks away and it's already midnight. But that said, vomiting on purpose. That was absolutely a thing, especially if you were rich, dramatic, and had a lot of peacock to get through. See, Roman elites treated vomiting the way modern people treat coffee breaks. It was strategic. After stuffing themselves with flamingo tongues and fig-stuffed mice, they'd step out, casually tickle their throat, sometimes with a feather, sometimes just with the pure force of entitlement, and come right back in, ready for round 2. It's basically like uninstalling an app just so your phone runs faster. This wasn't about disordered eating or ritual cleansing, it was about capacity. The goal wasn't satisfaction, it was excess. To eat until you physically couldn't, then make room. It's like if you went to a buffet and thought, you know what this needs? Intermission vomiting. And you weren't sitting politely at a table either. Roman dinners took place while reclining, on couches, on your left side, elbow propped, just vibing like a lumpy Greek statue, which sounds fun until you realise you're trying to digest oysters while lying sideways on a dusty pillow that smells like goat hair and disappointment. The awkward posture didn't help. In fact, it actively encouraged indigestion. And don't forget, these feasts lasted for hours. Like, think Netflix binge without a pause button, but instead of plot twists, it's just increasingly suspicious meats. Imagine a room full of sweaty aristocrats, bellies bulging, reclining like dying walruses, burping up fish sauce and periodically wandering off to hurl. That's not dinner. That's a gastric endurance sport. And the food? Oh, baby. We already talked about the dormice and the jellyfish, but it's important to remember that nothing was refrigerated. Raw meats and dairy products were just chilling, not in a fridge, just in the sun, like a dog with no plans. Garum, that fermented fish sauce they put on everything, was like Roman ketchup. Except instead of tomatoes, it was rotted fish organs left to stew in ceramic pots until the neighbourhood started filing complaints. People poured it on literally everything. Meat, eggs, fruit, probably even on their regrets. And sure, it masked the smell of spoiled food, but it also masked the warning signs of your impending gastrointestinal doom. Let's talk cookware for a second. Romans used a delightful array of pots and pans glazed with lead. Lead cups, lead spoons, even lead-lined wine jugs. So if the undercooked goat lungs didn't get you, the cutlery probably would. It's like cooking with a side of heavy metal poisoning. And that's assuming the oil wasn't rancid, the cheese wasn't crawling, and the oysters weren't just fermented grief in a shell. The concept of food safety back then was more of a suggestion, like the yellow light at an intersection. Technically there, but no one respects it. So naturally people got sick all the time. You might think, well, sure, but they must have had remedies, right? Oh, sweet naive listener. They did, but they were about as helpful as putting a band-aid on a haunted doll. See, Romans didn't understand food poisoning. They didn't know about bacteria or cross-contamination. When someone keeled over post-feast, the diagnosis was usually something poetic and deeply unhelpful, like cold vapours, or an imbalance of black bile, which incidentally does sound like what you'd say if someone asked how you were feeling after a Taco Bell bender. And the cures? Well, sometimes it was bloodletting. Other times it was a nice hot compress, or a burnt hedgehog wrapped in cabbage leaves. No, I'm not kidding. That was a thing. And yes, it probably made things worse, but hey, at least now you smelled like disappointment and hedgehog. Now imagine, you've just eaten 8 courses of mystery meat, a dozen suspect oysters, 3 goblets of wine laced with lead syrup, and something they told you was a pear, but you swear blinked at you. You're lying sideways, trying not to die, when suddenly, surprise, your stomach starts staging a violent protest. And where do you go? Oh, don't worry, there's a latrine nearby. Just past the courtyard, across the atrium, through a hallway with questionable frescoes, and down a flight of stairs that smells like vinegar and old feet. But that, dear listener, is a story for another. Oh wait, I promise not to say that. Let's just say, when your romantic evening ends with you whispering apologies to the gods and your internal organs, while lying on a stone couch and trying not to throw up on your neighbour's sandals, something, somewhere, has gone deeply wrong, and still, this was considered peak entertainment, lavish, cultured, a success, the kind of thing you'd brag about later, assuming you survived long enough to remember it. Honestly, the only thing more absurd than the food was how proud they were of it. So, next time you complain that your date talked too much about crypto, just remember, at least they didn't hand you a spoonful of peacock brain and ask if you liked the mouthfeel. We're not done yet though, because if you think the worst part of a Roman night out was the vomiting, you haven't met the Roman toilet. And oh, you're going to love this. Alright, let's pick up right where things were starting to get uncomfortable. You've survived the romance, the feast, the gurgling post-dinner regrets. Now you're about to face the part of Roman dating that never, ever makes it into the marble statues or HBO shows, the toilets. Because when you imagine ancient Rome, I'm guessing you picture gladiators, aqueducts, maybe some guy in sandals yelling about the Senate. What you probably don't imagine is sitting hip to hip with half-dressed strangers on a cold stone bench, your stomach doing the cha-cha from that lead-soaked dormouse you just ate. But that was reality. See, Roman toilets were communal. And I don't mean like a college dorm communal. I mean like a packed concert porta-potty without the walls communal. No doors, no partitions, just a long slab of perforated stone, like someone tried to reinvent Swiss cheese as a seating arrangement. You sat, you went, you chatted. Imagine ending a romantic evening by locking eyes with your date across a latrine trench while a slave pours vinegar over the community sponge. If that doesn't scream intimacy, I don't know what does. Ah yes, the tessorium. Let's talk about that sponge. The infamous vinegar-drenched multi-use butt sponge on a stick. Because Romans believed wiping was a group activity, the same sponge dunked in the same bucket, used over and over by the same hopeful citizens who just wanted their insides to stop turning inside out. Hygiene was a concept, sure, just not one they practiced. And before you ask, yes, people did get sick, constantly. Imagine the microbial cocktail marinating in that vinegar vat by day 3 of a heatwave. You'd have better luck wiping with a live eel. At least it might fight off some of the bacteria. Now, the Romans did actually have a sewer system, and I'm legally obligated by the ghost of a Roman engineer to admit that yes, the Cloaca Maxima was impressive. but being impressive doesn't mean it was safe. Waste ran beneath the city in open channels which occasionally backed up like your uncle's emotional trauma at Thanksgiving. That meant explosive methane, rising filth, and occasional cameos from rats that looked like they paid taxes. And if you think that's bad, remember, many latrines were located near the kitchen, because nothing says bon appetit like the faint scent of communal regret wafting through the atrium while someone roasts eel in honey. There's just something poetic about preparing a meal 5 feet from the consequences. Let's talk about how it felt. Picture reclining for hours at a dinner party, gorging yourself on peacock tongue and fermented fish goo, only to shuffle off, bloated, flushed, and deeply betrayed by your intestines, to wait in line for a seat at the group-grown bench. No privacy, no plumbing, just you, your date, and the guy from next door arguing about grain prices while aggressively making eye contact. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, at least it was normal for them. Maybe they didn't mind. Oh, you little pancake. They minded. We have graffiti from latrine walls, actual ancient Yelp reviews written in Latin profanity, complaining about the smell, the mess, and whoever kept stealing the sponges. That's right. People were out here stealing used sponges. I don't know what the black market rate for a bacteria popsicle was in 54 BC, but apparently it was worth risking public shame. And of course, all this exposure made Roman latrines hotbeds for disease, intestinal parasites, skin infections, worms. If it could crawl out of a sewer and ruin your week, it was probably living under your toilet seat, except there was no seat, just stone, always cold, sometimes damp, usually shared. We tend to romanticize history. We imagine togas flowing, grapes being gently fed into mouths, sunsets over marble courtyards. But the reality was more like, I just vomited goat lung, now my rear end is freezing, and Publius is sitting way too close while discussing his hernia. That's not romance. That's a hostage situation with plumbing. And again, this wasn't just the poor. Even the wealthy had latrines like this, in their homes, next to the kitchen, with no flush, no fans, no Febreze, and probably a pile of mouse bones in the corner from that last dinner party gone wrong. By now, you're probably wondering what happened after all this. After the meal, the bloating, the vomit-adjacent interlude, and the group bathroom finale. Did they go home and sleep it off? Did they recover gracefully? Oh no, that would require medicine. And Roman medicine, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly peer-reviewed. But we'll get to that, because once the food poisoning kicked in, and let's be clear, it did kick in, things went from socially awkward to medically catastrophic. You didn't get a Gatorade and a sick day. You got a Greek slave holding a bowl of herbs and praying to Asclepius that you didn't die in your sandals. So, to recap, if you were lucky, your date ended with mild indigestion and a romantic walk home. If you were unlucky, you ended the evening sharing a sponge with 3 strangers and trying not to combust from sewer gas. And if you were really unlucky, well, you'd better hope you angered the right gods because you were about to meet them. But hey, at least there was plenty of wine, right? Let's just take a breath together here, because we still haven't even gotten to the remedies, the wild, desperate, vaguely cursed remedies. And if you think wiping with a vinegar sponge was bad, oh honey, wait till you hear what they put on your wounds. Because now it's the morning after. And if you're imagining a sleepy stretch in bed followed by a greasy hangover breakfast and a regrettable scroll through last night's texts, oh no, sweet buttercup. This is ancient Rome. You're about to wake up violently, probably on a sticky straw mattress in a room that smells like warm vinegar and goat. And your stomach? It's staging a full-blown mutiny. So let's talk Roman medicine. Imagine you're hunched over, clutching your belly, trying to keep last night's jellyfish-stuffed dormouse down. Your head is pounding, your vision's blurry, and you're starting to question all your life choices, including dating that guy who owns more marble statues than functioning doors. What do? You call the medicus. Sounds impressive, right? Like maybe someone with a degree or, I don't know, a thermometer. Yeah, no. The average Roman medicus was often a Greek slave with all the medical training of someone who once saw a leaf and decided it looked medicinal. He shows up with a bag of mystery herbs, a handful of garlic, and the energy of someone who's going to say, "Have you tried bleeding?" within the first 5 minutes. Let's say you're lucky. You don't get bloodlet on the spot or force-fed crushed mouse skull. Instead, he brews you a tea from something called silphium, an herb so wildly over-harvested it went extinct faster than your will to live halfway through that second course of boiled peacock. If you're less lucky, he rubs your belly with warm olive oil and whispers a chant to ward off digestive demons. Because obviously, the problem wasn't food poisoning, it was evil spirits squatting in your colon. And if that doesn't work, don't worry, they've got more options, like applying a poultice made of crushed beetles and goose fat, or giving you a suppository made from wine, honey, and, this is real, crocodile dung. Because when your internal organs are screaming, what they really need is a little reptile feces to sort things out. Oh, and don't expect privacy for this whole ordeal. You're probably laid out on a couch in the atrium, with a family member holding your hand and another one holding a bowl. Because nothing says "I love you" like making direct eye contact while someone applies a dung compress to your lower back. Now, let's say your symptoms take a darker turn. Fever spikes. You can't keep anything down. Your medicus is out of beetles. What then? Well, you might start wondering if the gods are mad at you. Maybe you didn't sacrifice enough incense to the household spirits. Maybe you ate that peacock liver during an unlucky hour. Or maybe, just maybe, the person you ghosted last week left a defixio under your doorstep. A lead curse tablet asking the gods to explode your bowels like a dropped amphora. And before you scoff, these were real. Romans made little lead scrolls scratched full of curses like "May his entrails turn to snakes," folded them up, and tossed them into sacred wells or nailed them to the temple of some vengeful deity. You know, normal conflict resolution. If things went really south, your family might start preparing for the worst. Death from food-related illnesses was not rare. In fact, it was so common that entire Roman streets probably smelled faintly of regret and undercooked oysters. And you didn't just die, you died symbolically. Sometimes people were buried with remnants of their last meal, because why not drag that boiled pig uterus into the afterlife with you? Others were given little tomb offerings like bread, cheese, or figs, presumably, so their ghosts could keep snacking while haunting whoever brought the garum. Speaking of ghosts, the Romans were very into them. If someone died violently or with unresolved issues, like, say, diarrhea-based betrayal, they could come back as a lemur, not the animal, a ghost. Though, frankly, a raccoon with trust issues would have the same effect. So naturally, the family would try to appease the spirit with rituals, pour out some wine, toss some beans, maybe whisper, "Sorry for the spoiled oysters." And if all else failed, well, they'd just wall up the room. Because nothing says "we loved you" like bricking over your haunted death chamber and pretending it never happened. So where does that leave us? Roman dating started with awkward family arrangements and ended with possibly being buried next to the guy who gave you intestinal parasites. You were poisoned, purged, spiritually hexed, and, if you made it out alive, mildly traumatized by the experience of sharing a latrine with 8 senators and 1 very confident chicken. All of this for love. But not the kind we talk about today. Roman love was practical, strategic, often sticky. It didn't smell like roses, it smelled like warm goat butter and fermented fish sauce. And yet, they built poetry around it. Statues, epic tragedies. Love was pain, yes, but also apparently indigestion, heat stroke, and mild tetanus. So, next time you go on a bad date, and the worst thing that happens is your appetizer was cold, and they talked about crypto for 2 hours, just remember, at least you're not being treated with goose lard by a man who stores leeches in his bathtub. Anyway, that's the end of our wildly unnecessary and mildly concerning journey through Roman romance. Whether you're still awake, halfway asleep, or questioning every salad you've ever eaten, sweet dreams, safe drive, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy history with a faint smell of mildew and poor decisions. Good night, you delightful little history sponge. Catch you next time.